being able to focus on something for a prolonged period of time is probably one of the best predictors of success, if you ask me. If you take a look at any of the sports person like Novak Djokovic from Serbia or whatnot, he started like training tennis when he was 5 years old, and he is 30 plus now, and he's still doing it every single day. The macro cycle was roughly like a 3-month period where I would focus to a single subfield of machine learning, be that generative adversarial network scans or neural style transfer or transformers or GraphML. I would spend like 3 months focusing on that. Those biological connections need to form. And for that, it takes time. If you start switching every single day, you will at the end just end up with some blurry concepts in your head. A lot of people can get started with something, be it like learning data science, going to the gym, and they are maybe 3 weeks in, and then they switch their path along the way and just do something completely else. In the grand scheme of things, 3 months is literally nothing.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Aleksa Gordić. Aleksa is an ex-Google DeepMind and Microsoft machine learning engineer who recently launched Ortus, a startup aimed at helping users make YouTube videos more accessible and interactive. I'm excited to announce that we have Ortus working on my YouTube channel, and you can try it out for free by quickly installing the Chrome plugin there. Aleksa also runs the AI Epiphany YouTube channel, where he shares his learnings from reading papers on the latest generative AI research. In this episode, we learn about his awesome learning framework that he stole from weightlifters, how he landed his job at DeepMind, and why he left that same job at the peak of the AI hype to start his own company. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I know I did. Aleksa, thank you so much for joining us on the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So, I've been following you on YouTube for a while. I've also seen some new startup buzz around your LinkedIn channels and these types of things. And I'm really excited to learn more from you today about what you're working on, a little bit of your history with moving from software engineering to ML engineering or to machine learning at DeepMind. But I'm also interested in how you're using large language models and a lot of these things to facilitate the individual consumer experience on YouTube. So again, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So the first question I ask all of our guests, just to get to know them a little bit better, is how did you first get interested in data? Was there a pivotal moment, or was it more of a slow progression over time?
Mm-hmm. So for me, because I'm more from machine learning / software engineering background, I guess when you say data, for me, it kind of started with digital image processing. So I was on the image side, and then once I started working for Microsoft, because I was working on the HoloLens project, which is this super sci-fi holographic type of 3D device. Actually, Apple Vision Pro that just came out has many of the features that HoloLens 2 had back in 2018. So that was kind of weird. Anyhow, getting back to the data story, so that brought me to computer vision because it was obviously very, very visual, and that means you have to use computer vision, and where is computer vision, there is machine learning. So that's kind of how I slowly got into the whole data story. It was through images, and then the computer vision / machine learning area where I was working on the eye tracking actually feature for HoloLens. So that was
very cool,
super fun.
I've gotten to wear one of the HoloLenses when I was in my master's of computer science. Someone got a hands on one and brought one in, and I can't help but thinking now, like, I just don't think the hardware technology quite existed yet to be able to build the vision that was created there. And I'm like, man, if they had just done that now, I think it would have been so successful compared to when it was being done then. And it's crazy to think about how timing works with entrepreneurship, timing works with products and these types of things. It's like the idea and the technology stack, as well as like the technically like the algorithm stack, all have to line up for you to have like one of these crazy products. And 100%. It seems like that's happening more and more now, especially with like the large language models and what we're seeing.
100%. By the way, just a quick question there. Did you use HoloLens 1 or HoloLens 2 when you were playing with HoloLens? Do you remember maybe?
So this would have been in, I think, 2015.
Okay, that was HoloLens 1. The HoloLens 2 was a completely qualitatively like different device because you finally had the eye tracking, as I said, that's something I worked on. Also hand tracking, really everything that like Vision Pro now has. It was just not as good, obviously, because it was 5 years ago, but it was very, very good. So
Amazing.
yeah.
I saw a lot. So I mean, my main work is in professional golf, and I saw that there was a lot of people, or like there was an attempt to use it on putting greens where you'd wear it and you'd putt and you'd see like the lines of the putts and things like that, which I think was pretty neat. That was a pretty sick application for that. I would love to hear more of the whole story or a less abridged version of your career of, you know, how you first got interested in technology as well. You know, you started as a builder, and then how does that end up with you at Microsoft and then at DeepMind and then starting your own thing? To me, there's so much of a rich context there. You know, you coming from Serbia as well, that's another like very interesting wrinkle in your career progression.
Yeah, so the story for me, like back in high school, I was not really into technology because nobody from my environment, including my parents, was like nobody was techie. Like actually, everybody in my family is like either like surgeon or like pharmacist, etc., etc. So I was kind of the black sheep. Yeah, I was kind of the black sheep in the family. And then mostly out of the challenge, I enrolled into the electrical engineering faculty because it was considered the hardest thing, and I was really just attracted to hard things. I still am. And that brought me to like electrical engineering, and then I was studying electronics for the first couple of years, and then I realized at the end of my studies, like, wait, the field is not that transparent. I was super disappointed with salaries. Like salary range for the hardest faculty in Serbia, like you could expect like roughly 800 euros for a full-time job, your first job, which was terrible for such a like hard after wrapping up such a hard like faculty, I guess. And so, whereas on the other hand, software engineering was like 2,000 euros plus, which was for Serbian standards fairly good. There was definitely one dimension why I pivoted, because more opportunities, more transparency, like hackathons, datatons, all of that. So I kind of went into software engineering. And then somewhere around that period, that was, I guess, 2017, I got an offer to work for Microsoft after having gone through like a completely self-curated like software engineering curriculum where I learned a bunch about algorithms and data structures. And after that, I was working at Microsoft for almost 3 years as I said, on the HoloLens device. And somewhere like initially, I enrolled, I applied as a software engineer. And then after a year, because as I said, I got exposed to computer vision and ML, and then I started learning it in my free time, like Coursera, like classic stuff, like Ndrang, all of that. Started reading papers, and then slowly got my way to kind of pivot internally to a ML role. And then it was even more like learning. And then pandemic kind of struck at that point. That was, I guess, early 2019. And since that moment on, I started a YouTube channel to, I guess it acted as a forcing function for me to read the papers and explain it to others. So it was kind of, again, multiple reasons why I made my channel. And through that whole process, I learned so much because I read hundreds and hundreds of papers, also implemented a bunch of papers and open source projects. And eventually that led me to DeepMind. And that was, I guess, end of 2021. And I was there until very recently, until March this year. And now I'm building my own startup. So that's kind of a very condensed timeline of what happened since 2013 when I enrolled into electrical engineering faculty.
No, that's amazing. And you know, something from watching your videos, from speaking with you, that I've noticed is you're very good and you explicitly create roadmaps for yourself. So you made a roadmap for probably learning software engineering, but also getting the interview. You made a roadmap for learning machine learning, and also, I imagine, for preparing for the interview you did at DeepMind. Is that something that's always come natural to you, or is that something that you had to develop over time? Where does that ability to create structure come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it starts from the childhood. I was very organized as a kid as well. Like I just kept everything clean. It was always a very interesting contrast with my brother. We used to live in the same room when we were kids, obviously. And so my room was like super clean and nice, and his room was like the opposite. polar opposite. So maybe the root kind of starts there. And then the main thing for me was like just like street workout and calisthenics. So like through doing all of those like self-motivated types of workouts, I was slowly learning how to curate my own like trainings and like how many squats should I do, how many push-ups, like sit-ups, all of that. And that kind of lasted all the way through high school when I started learning languages. And then with languages, I was again started like reading many books and like trying to see what's the most optimal way to do this. And then in a just like self-supervised way, I guess, I learned a lot of tricks just because I was doing it for so many years. And then until faculty, I already have built this type of like discipline and like ability to just set a goal and decompose the path to that goal into like smaller steps and then just attack them one at a time and like execute on those. So it was many different paths, but mostly it was like working out and languages for me to learn those like core skills, which I back then thought are not going to be that useful, but it turns out it transfers super nicely to whatever I want to learn.
Maybe the most useful.
Exactly, literally.
I think it's so cool that your physical skills that you developed or the philosophy you developed with calisthenics also transferred over into the work that you do and some of these other things. Something I've talked about in the past on the podcast is how I believe, for example, sport or anything athletic, it does a lot, not just for your body, but also for cultivating a mindset and things along those lines. Historically, I've talked quite a bit about how team sports are very good for learning to collaborate with others, but I didn't realize this until you just described it. I mean, you prompted this in me, is that individual sports have a very unique way of teaching someone to self-organize and prioritize. So, the majority of sports I played in golf and in jiu-jitsu are individual sports. And when I'm out there, it's only me. Like, I have to figure out the plan to get better. I have to decide when I'm going to practice. It's completely up to me, and I'm held accountable to only myself. And in order to be good at those, I have to actually like figure out when I'm going to practice, figure out exactly what to work on, and go about doing all of those things. And I think that, whether it's just creating a workout routine and sticking to it, or focusing on an individual pursuit like that, it carries over and has these incredibly beneficial effects on work, on entrepreneurship, on any of these things. Because one thing I've learned, if people are going out on their own as a content creator, as an entrepreneur, any of those types of things, it's the same feeling where it's just you have to figure out what to do that day. You have to prioritize, you have to set goals, you have to set deadlines, you have to do all these things. And I don't think that's like a skill that is explicitly taught in other settings, as well as it's learned from those personal endeavors, whether it's 100%. Physical or whether it's like projects.
100%, especially because like going through the schooling system, you're always in this structured environment where somebody's telling you what to do, right? So like this type of endeavor is something that you just build those muscles, which you like metaphorical muscles for whatever you're trying to learn. By the way, I did train basketball for almost 4 years. So early in my life. So when I was like second grade of elementary school. And I think that social component and playing with others was crucial to get that feeling of more, like I was more into team sports when I was very young. And I think in those formative years that helped me also like get some social skills because if you just start like on your own, I guess you do miss out on some of those opportunities and like growth on like being a team player as well. So I can't quantify how important that was, but I think those 4 years were very important as well.
I agree. I mean, I think team sports teach you explicitly different skills, and one of those is conflict or like being okay with conflict. So in teams, like, yes, it's a team thing, but individuals are contributors to that. And if someone doesn't fill their role, like you have to manage, okay, well, like, how do we handle that? Like, what do I do if this other person doesn't keep up their end of the bargain, or they don't perform, or they don't output? And that flows. I mean, I think anyone can see the parallel with that and with the workplace or any of these types of things. It's like, oh, how do I manage working with this coworker that does whatever? And if you don't have any exposure to that when you're a kid or when you're growing up, it's going to be really confusing when you get into an office environment where you 100%. Didn't have the the benefit of those learning muscles when you were younger.
Especially when you start a company, I guess. Like I think that type of journey is better suited if you want to build your own company. Whereas if you want to be content creator or well, even content creation obviously can be much more social. It depends on the content creator himself or herself. But like those kind of journeys align nicely. One aligns nicely with more of a solo journey later on, and the other one, when you're like a CEO of your company, obviously you need to be a team player, and so yeah, it's fascinating how much you can learn from sports.
Yeah, well, when you're the CEO, you kind of have to also be the coach, and that's something that very few of us actually learn when we're younger in any setting, which is a whole nother bag of worms. I'd be interested in how we could build that into education or give kids more experiences of leadership, because there's really there are very few parallels. I mean, there are some opportunities, you become class president, you're a team captain, whatever it might be, but that's one of, like 10, 15 kids on a basketball team. Not everyone is getting that same exposure. And so, very, very interesting to think about development and how we would build that in. Sort of going back to that structure you create, I'm really interested. Can you maybe walk through how you approached preparing for the software engineering interviews, and then also a little bit about, actually probably even more about, your approach to learning the machine learning infrastructure? Because to me, you had this very unique approach of taking a micro and macro lens, and also having inputs and outputs associated with that. And I just am really interested to hear sort of how your mind worked around that.
Makes sense. So for the software engineering, it really started with a mind shift. Like I know it sounds cliche, but it is a thing of mindset. Everything else was just downstream from my shift that happened like that year in summer 2017. So as I said, I was wrapping up my faculty, and I realized I spent a couple of years on electronics, whereas some of my peers were already like doing competitive programming for multiple years. And I felt like very strongly, like existentially, that I'm lagging behind. And like because of that desire, I started reaching out to some of the best people I knew from Serbia. That friend of mine told me, "Hey, go through this cracking the coding interview book." And I think that's how it started. So I was in Germany doing some internship. He told me about that book. I came back to Belgrade like September 2017, and I was like, okay, I know now what I have to do to land a job at a big tech. You have to know how to do algorithms. You have to understand data structures. Let's just go and execute on that. So what I've done, I just went through the book page by page, and I was just doing stuff, and then also enrolled in one class on my university, even though I was going actually with folks who were 1 year younger than me. So it was kind of weird because throughout my whole life, I was mostly like excelling with grades and stuff, mostly, let's say. And then this was kind of a weird experience. And what I've done, I literally locked myself up and spent every single day just like doing the algorithms, doing those problems. I had on my like door of my room, I had like a small paper where I would just do a check of every single day that was successful, and that was pretty much every single day. So it was, I guess, tirelessly just working on slowly going through this book. So that book can already provide me with a curriculum. I didn't really have to be super imaginative there. I was also going through some competitive programming websites, like back then, was it Code Forces, a couple more of those. So all that combined, and also going to hackathons and applying for big tech and getting rejections. So first couple of attempts were completely failures. Like I think my first interview ever was with this Facebook guy, and like he started roasting me immediately because I was not like using ternary operator. I was using like if else or something. He was like, "Why are you not using a ternary operator?" I was like, "It's equivalent. Come on." Anyhow, so it was a long set of a lot of rejections, and then later in 2018, while I was doing another internship in Brazil, I got an offer like in like August 2018. So it took roughly 9 months of just going like constantly learning about algorithms and competing and to land a job at Microsoft. So it was kind of that first like curriculum I had.
I'd like to take a quick second to thank one of our sponsors, Pathrise. Job hunting can be daunting, particularly in today's unpredictable world. Pathrise matches you with a dedicated mentor in your field to provide tailored support throughout your job search journey. From optimizing your resume and application process to mastering your interview skills, their expert guidance prepares you to secure your dream job and to negotiate a competitive salary. The cherry on top is that you don't pay until you secure that high-paying job that you've been aiming for. Don't hesitate. Visit pathrise.com/KenG to get matched with an expert mentor today. This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z8 workstation. I really love that the Z workstations can come standard with Linux or WSL2, and they can be configured with the Data Science Software Stack Manager. With the Software Stack Manager, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show. So before we get into the other curriculum, I'm interested in how you approached the failures of the rejections. What was your philosophy, mindset? I mean, you obviously kept working and you eventually were very successful in your career, but I mean, everyone knows it's not fun to face those rejections, but how did you keep going in lieu of those?
I don't know. I just don't give up. It's simple to say, but I don't give up just because I got one rejection. I knew I have to try many more times, and because I've been following some other people in the space, and I saw that other people are literally sending hundreds of applications where I was nowhere near there. I sent maybe 3 or 4, and I got rejected in maybe 2 or 3 and landed one. So I knew I'm still I'm not trying my best. I was just focused on getting better, and I knew I'm not nowhere near my potential, and so I just kept on working. So I think a valuable lecture there is you want to be familiar with other people's stories. Because when you're super young, you think you're in a super difficult situation and nobody went through this. And then the more you learn about how others went through similar stories and gave even 10x the amount of work you put in, then it becomes easier. And then okay, it's possible. It's just I'm just not being serious enough. So all of that combined, I guess, knowledge and just the internal grit and the skills I learned throughout my youth, I guess, with the workouts and stuff, where you just go push through the workout and you don't stop just because you feel the pain. So it's kind of all of those skills combined led to that type of behavior, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you were talking about other people's stories. I think that there is a pretty cool data component of that. If you know what the baseline is, let's say 1 in 10 applications that you submit get through, or of the average person, 1 in 10 gets through, and you're at 1 in 7, you're actually a lot better than the average person, or whatever the median or whatever you want to use. And we get discouraged because 1 in 7 is really bad, but you're well, based on the baseline, that's actually really good. And very few people look at it that way, when in reality, that is the most authentic way to look at it, is against the group that you're competing against, you're actually doing significantly better. And on the other side of that, if you're 1 in 15 or 1 in 20, you can say, oh, I might be doing something wrong, or maybe I don't have a large enough sample. That's also a very viable thing. But looking at these things through a more quantitative lens, in my perspective, it takes the emotion out of it, because it's just objective. These are the numbers. This is what I'm doing. It's very much less oh, I'm a failure, whatever it might be. It's no, I'm just part of this, this data set, rather than the other way around. So I think you were implicitly doing that, or intuitively doing that. But it's just something that I've seen more recently, because people are collecting data on this. Maybe we should know what the baseline is so that we have something viable to compare against.
100%. And if you do fall into, you get 15 rejections, that might also be a good signal. You have to rethink how you're approaching. Because just putting in a lot of work doesn't mean you're putting in a lot of good work. And I think that's the trap a lot of people get into. And also throughout my throughout my life with calisthenics, I've seen a lot of people who were training for 10 years, but you really couldn't see the results. So that's because they were doing the same thing over and over again, and not getting better. So you have to learn from your mistakes. You have to have this mindset of how can I get incrementally better and better, and then grit on top of that, then you can kind of achieve things. But like, you should listen to the numbers as well. I think you put it very nicely.
Yeah, well, it's funny to see so many parallels. I mean, I see that happening for me in jiu-jitsu all the time, where there are guys that have trained longer than me that were better than me, and it's like, well, I'm better than they are now. I'm passing them because I focused a little bit on that meta learning where, oh, I'm actually looking for feedback loops. I'm not just doing the same thing over and over again. I'm looking at inherently what are the things that make the largest difference, and I'm focusing on those areas of improvement. And there's some very simple things like that for interviews too, like where you actually apply through, getting a referral, like looking and researching the companies and figuring out what types of questions they ask. It's like, if you weren't doing any of those things and you were just like focusing really hard on this super vague, broad question of how to quote unquote win an interview, you're probably not going to get that far.
Yeah. And also just the resume, there is so many components, right? Like you might be focusing on a like, if you're not getting even the invites for the interviews, then something's obviously bad with your resume or whatnot. But like, if you get there, then you kind of pass that stage, and you have to focus on different things. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and getting there too is like a win in and of itself. Where a lot of things people are like, well, I didn't get the interview, and it's like, well, you got the interview. That's better than you were doing before. I think so many people also forget where not even though it's not a win, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and you can build momentum on it. And also, it's a learning experience, which you wouldn't
100%.
have if you didn't get.
I felt super confident after the Facebook interview, because that was the first time, even though I failed like immediately, and I think I knew already during the interview that I'm not gonna get accepted or anything. But like, just going out to the first interview ever and seeing how it looks like just the mechanics, the pure mechanics of how the interview works, also makes you a bit more relaxed, and you just know, okay, it's not that big of a deal, and you can do those mock interviews. So it's definitely a good thing. It's much better than if you've never seen the interview. So yeah.
I love that advice so much, because I get a lot of people and they're like, oh, am I ready to go do interviews yet? I know X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, just go, like, do interviews, because that's going to be the best way to tell if you're ready or not. That's going to be the best way to figure out what it's actually like. Rather than asking me questions who is not going to be interviewing you, go do the actual interviews. And like, the funny thing is, they're like, well, I'll miss my one shot at Facebook or whatever it might be. And I'm like, I know people have interviewed at Facebook like 7 times.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure like the first interview, they're not going to completely write you off for the rest of your entire career. So it is worth it to just experiment and get those reps in. And, the downside of failing an interview is so much less bad than what anyone believes it to be.
100%. 100%. And also, I think, again, the numbers here, I think actually it's more of a rule that you will not pass the first interview, like the first time you apply, because just the pure number, the sheer numbers of applicants that Facebook and Googles of the world are getting is just so mind-boggling. So you have to fail. You'll probably fail the first time. So that it's completely fine.
Yeah. One guest I had, I think his name is Ash. He applied to LinkedIn 5 times and then finally landed the role, and then realized like later that he didn't like working there. So.
Oh, that's usually that happens. Well, listen.
Yeah.
Those companies are like, there is a lot of people are romanticizing big tech too much. Like they are huge companies, right? There is hundreds of thousands of people working at big tech, which means it's not that hard. Like, that's a huge pool of people. Like it's not that hard, like as much as people would love to think. And then that means that there is a lot of people who are not doing the most exciting stuff in the world, right? Like, somebody has to make sure that Chrome is working, that the Windows, that some random feature in Windows is working. Like, there is so many boring roles you could have.
That could be someone's entire job.
Exactly. And it's always like, it's just the credentials, the glory of the big tech. But like, I think that it's not as glorious as people like to think. Like, I think I was fairly lucky, especially like when I started at Microsoft. I literally was in the best team. Like, I'm probably the only team where I would work in Serbia. So it was very exciting, cutting edge machine learning, very researchy, as opposed to being in SQL, for example, Razor, where you're much more closer to business. It's more about patching some bugs, some weird stuff, and being on call. So it's not as fun. And again, I kind of won the lottery with that first job.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think about, getting into these companies is the first hurdle, and then get on a good team. Being on a good team is also a little luck of the draw, some of your individual skill and specialization. Um, but I also think more broadly, what we're seeing now is that these companies are, like, they're profit motivated. They're public companies. They're not your family. They're not these types of things. Like, there isn't the loyalty that people used to have before. You shouldn't have that loyalty because, like, they don't have any special love for you as an individual. It's more your skill set or what you can do. And I think that gets conflated for a lot of people sometimes. And, you actually can find that in some smaller companies. You can find that in startups. You can find that in a lot of these other places. But I don't think if that's what you're looking for, you're going to find it in a lot of these big tech companies. Like, they have great culture. They have a lot of these things, but, like, the culture is not there to be your family. The culture is there to retain you as an employee, which I think are two very different things.
Exactly. I think during the layoffs we saw earlier this year, there was like a industry-wide disillusionment with that concept of, hey, we're a family here, whatnot. Like in Google and elsewhere, like I just have a lot of friends from different big tech companies. So 100%. But also going to startups in defense of big tech, like also in startups, unless you are one of the early engineers or one of the founders, like it's hard because some inherent constraints like Dunbar's number. As soon as you scale up to, okay, that's already 100 plus people, like it's not, you cannot really maintain any quality relationship with all of those people. So I think that's kind of the curse of of this life, I guess.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is like one of my favorite things of all time. So for those that aren't familiar who are listening, Dunbar's number is around 150, 200 people. And there's two sort of paths to it. So, like, the first is that's generally the largest number of people we can keep in our active working memory or social network at a period of time. It's also the point in organizations where incentive structures break down. So, once you get to that 150, 200 person mark that you described, the incentive structure switches from how can I support the organization to how can I do the best for myself in getting promoted or things along those lines. I'm not sure if you've read Loon Shots, but you basically like cited directly from that book. But I also like to go on, not to go too far into this tangent, but I also believe that like communities of 150, 200 people are like sort of how humans are meant to live and operate. Just because then everyone in that community, or as many people in that community's incentives, are aligned, whether it's for getting food or sharing or whatever it might be. Outside of that, again, it starts to break down, and we have people who are both completely valid in their experiences, disagreeing because of their different life experiences or their incentive structure. So very interesting as a startup founder like yourself to be familiar with that concept and like knowing like, okay, if we grow, this is an additional constraint that we have to evaluate. So
100%.
we went
I'm glad to have that problem once we scale up to 150 plus people. That's going to be a good problem to have. But like getting back just quickly to the whole thing we were saying about big tech, I think it's important to say that, and I don't think a lot of beginners are aware of this. It's so much more important, like which team you apply for and in which team you're embedded when you're in big tech, than which big tech which company you kind of end up in. Like whether you're a Googler or Microsoft or Nvidia or whatnot, you can find it's always a power law inside of company, as with anything else. Like you're going to have stellar individuals who are doing amazing work, and you're going to have median individuals just by definition, right? And so like it's so much more important that you pick the right team. And unfortunately, a lot of these big tech companies don't really allow you the flexibility to choose, to see like do some data driven approach. Where I know that Facebook has this Meta, where you join them and then you have a boot camp for like I think 4 weeks. and you test out like 5 or 6 teams, and then you basically go to the team that you prefer, which is not my experience so far, because Microsoft and DeepMind, Google, it's more of like before the interview, say what you would love to be working, and then they kind of match you, and you better hope you were lucky, right? So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And like I think that there is this false notion of people sorting which company is better, like Google being better than Microsoft or whatnot. You can find much better individuals at Microsoft than at Google in some teams. It's it varies a lot. It's not like all Googlers are much better than Microsoft folks or not whatnot. I think I felt the need to say this out loud, because my perception before I started applying for Big Tech was that Google is this like the best thing ever, and then everything else is second grade. But it's not the case. It's humans all around. You can find amazing. Maybe the baseline is a bit higher than, I don't know, some other company, but like the team that you're in is ultimately what matters. And that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, like bringing that to some like basic statistics, like each of these companies generally follow some sort of normal distribution of their employees' ability, and there's 100% overlap, and the tails are very likely not too dissimilar. So I think that's actually not something I had really thought of before. I mean, my personal interest is not working in a big tech company, but I never really thought of it in the way that you just described, where there are these pockets where like, yeah, there's people do it. Every single big tech company out there, there is someone who's doing brilliant work, without a doubt. Right. And how different are they from the other companies? Like, probably not very different. If they're really good, there's probably a lot of incentives for them to stay that the company is providing as well.
Yeah, and also you can find people who work at startups who are way better than anyone you can find in big tech. That's also the case. It's just that they are not in. You don't have this glorious credential of being Googler or Stanford or MIT or whatnot. And now that I've
or they're coming from one of those places.
Yeah. So I came from Serbia and all of this, and I didn't have like any of these badges. And now that I kind of accumulated a couple of them, like I now feel like it's not that big of a deal. Like, then again, I might be biased. Like I'm working every single day, and I'm putting in probably way more like effort into this than many other people. So it's not probably as comparable. But I think there is a lot of misconceptions about like working in tech industry in general. Like, when you just wrap up with your faculty, you don't know so many things, and you're just like so naive. But yeah.
So I 100% agree with you. And I do think that software engineering and the data domain more broadly, it's becoming a lot more about what you've built than where you've worked or any of these more superficial things. Like, if you're a public contributor to an open, like anything open source, and you're making a meaningful impact there, in my mind, that is just as impactful as having, I worked at XYZ company on your resume.
Probably more
because it's also public, and like people can see the work that you've been doing. I mean, for example, when you come out of DeepMind, as you described, you have to sign NDAs, and you can't really talk about what you've been doing because like it's probably like important to the company. So like, how are we supposed to know the quality of your work and these types of things when, like, in public and building startups and doing these types of things, like I can see directly the impact of your product on any of the content I produce or whatever it might be.
Exactly. So, and that's a big part of the reason why there is so many misconceptions, because people cannot really say stuff. Like, if there is some bad stuff, you cannot really say it out loud, because then you get into trouble, and then that kind of perpetuates this state of misconception, and mostly the communication and information flow happens in the side channels, and like, just let's go out for a beer, and then people chat and say stuff, and then you realize how it works. And yeah,
it's funny how those things work. But I appreciate you talking about and like cutting through some of these misconceptions, because that is, I think, a lot of the problem in the broader domain, that the tech atmosphere, is that there's just a lack of complete information, and a lot of people, that causes a lot of people a lot of mental distress, which is unfortunate. So we've gone a little away from on a little tangent, which I think was 100% worthwhile, but I really do want to focus on the macro and micro cycle of learning machine learning, because to me, that was something I hadn't seen before. And I think it could be really helpful to a lot of people who are approaching a field like this.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the idea is not original at all. It's something that, so my brother is, in his free time, he's a power lifter. Even though it's his free time, he lifts over 300 kilos deadlifts without a belt or anything. Like he's just super strong, and he's kind of big. He's 165 kilos the last time I checked. And so from that whole powerlifting space, those people have these periodizations, like if I'm not butchering the word. So like you have to kind of load your body to certain, like you start increasing the weights, but then you need to, after a month or 3 months or whatnot, deload yourself. So that means not do the one max rep, or like 80% of your one max rep, but instead go 50% or something. Like you're kind of going through these phases. And so that's where the idea basically comes from. So for me, the macro cycle was roughly like a 3-month period where I would focus to a single subfield of machine learning, be that generative adversarial network scans or neural style transfer or transformers or GraphML. I would spend like 3 months focusing on that. And then like during those periods, I would have like these smaller periods, which I call the microcycles, like obviously. And so those would be like maybe 2 weeks periods. And I would try to switch between the so-called input and output states. So what I mean by that is that people mostly, when you're at school, you're mostly just ingesting information. So you're just like listening to your teachers, you're reading, you're absorbing the information, but you're not really thinking through. You're not processing. You're not trying to create internal mental models. And so I forced myself explicitly, just knowing that there is this inherent bias where we always consume more than we produce. I forced myself to have 2 weeks periods where I'm producing. So be that like a Medium blog where I'm just going to write down something, or like create a video, or code up a project from scratch. All of those are more, okay, I have to kind of distill the stuff I've learned and now like produce something and share it with the others. So there are multiple benefits to that. There is one of them is, as I said, you learn better because you switch between the input and output. The second one is you get public credentials. And I think that's a big part for why I even got the opportunity to apply at DeepMind. Like just because of all of the great work I've done publicly and helping others and showcasing my skills. So that's it in a nutshell, basically. It's fairly simple. I'm just using powerlifting terminology there.
I love that you pull in powerlifting terminology, these other outside things, and apply them to a learning domain like this. To me, that's essentially what all learning is about, is sort of like transferring from other fields. I'm interested in how you settled on the time periods. So the 3 months, 2 weeks, those types of things. I personally think that's a very good amount of time to spend on each topic. I think a lot of people are like, oh, I did that for a week and I'm done, which to me, it's like, well, these fields are relatively complex. There's a lot of nuance to them. How did you decide that was the right amount of time for you?
I think again it came from like my previous experience with calisthenics and just like gym and stuff. Your body, if you think of your mind is ultimately a hardware device. It's not something abstract, right? And those synapses and like all of those processes are biological ultimately, even though they do happen on a different time scale compared to your body. So even when you get like a small cut or injury, it does take 2-3 weeks for the body to recover. And for the muscles, if you get like a very, very bad muscle sore, it's the same with brain. Like sometimes when you do too much, when you read too much, like you feel your brain is like full of these toxins or whatnot, and then you go sleep, and tomorrow day you're already better, but you still kind of feel this haze, if that's the term. And so because of that, I knew I have to stuck with something, just because of the fact that those biological connections need to form. And for that, it takes time. It's not something you can just switch if you start switching every single day, you will at the end, like just end up with some blurry like concepts in your head. They have not crystallized fully. And then that means you cannot fetch them at demand and use them to construct your own further models. So that's kind of the reason why like a bit longer periods. 3 months is obviously very like random because it's a nice number. Maybe it's already like 40 days or I don't know, whatever. But for me, like 3 months is a nice chunk of time. But like just one more thing, like you said, like in my opinion, this is more of a breadth first approach because I have a lot of folks who've gone the PhD postdoc routes, and that's actually that first search. So they go and do, like, for example, my good friend Petr Veličković, he's done graph machine learning, and he spent like 4 years doing only that. And then he went to the industry, to DeepMind, and now he's working there for almost 4 years again. So that's like 8 years of a single field. That's truly depth. That's when exactly. So like anybody who goes the PhD route, like that can be considered mostly depth first search, because some of them, I remember reading one of Karpati's blogs. He did say that for the first 2 years of his PhD, he was doing more of a meta loop. So I guess very similar thing to what I've done, where he went through a bunch of different subfields, and then he kind of drilled down into, what was it? I think he was doing the captioning and stuff like that back in the early days before the whole deep learning boom happened.
Yeah. There's a couple things in what you were describing there that really stuck out to me. So I think compared to what the average person entering the field is doing, you are going in more depth than they are. I mean, people are spending a couple days on an algorithm, like, oh, I know it, going on to the next thing. And that ties into what you were saying about sort of not having an idea crystallized in your mind. I see this concept through everything that I do, is that we have to reach a critical mass to be able to move on to something else. So like, let's take YouTube, right? I think you have to create a critical mass of content to be able to not allocate as much time to that endeavor anymore and for it to continue to grow. And it's the same idea with learning a machine learning concept, is that, wow, I have to get to the point where I understand it well enough that like the overarching concepts are concrete to me, and then I can move on and I can reference that one as like its own concept, but reference it as something that like, oh, this idea is similar to this idea, and to create that mental map. And I think the amount of time that you're spending, it does seem like a lot to a lot of probably new machine learning students, but it's paying dividends because it doesn't necessarily atrophy. You're using it as like an enhancer of other topics, because you start to see the relationships and things. And to me, that was something that really stuck out in what you were saying, but also in the content of yours that I've watched, is like, okay, you're doing this to learn for the future and to build this understanding, rather than to learn it and just apply it and then forget about it, which was very powerful on my end.
Exactly. And I think one of the main like traits that successful people have, and I deeply believe this at this point, and that's that the consistency part. Like everybody, like a lot of people can get started with something, be it like learning data science, be it like going to the gym, and they are maybe 3 weeks in, and then they switch their path along the way and just do something completely else. Like being able to focus on something for a prolonged period of time is probably one of the best predictors of success, if you ask me. Like, and so in the grand scheme of things, 3 months is literally nothing. Like, again, here it helps to understand and have some context about other people's stories. And I think one of them, very fascinating example is, Georgy Perelman? I'm probably butchering his name. He was a Russian mathematician who solved the Poincaré's hypothesis. And he spent 7 years of solo work. He ultimately got mad or something, and didn't even accept the Fields Medal and disappeared from the whole mathematics scene. But he spent 7 years doing something, and maybe there was a bad example because he kind of went, and he's a special human in general. But if you take a look at any of the sports person, like Novak Djokovic from Serbia or whatnot, he started training tennis when he was 5 years old, and he's 30 plus now, and he's still doing it every single day. So we're talking about decades here, not 3 months. That's why I think 3 months is a super small period of time. Year is already small period. 10 years now we're talking. But 1-2 days, you're still in the very, very beginner mode. If you cannot focus on something for multiple months or years, you're still in a super beginner mode, and it's very hard to compete on a global level unless you get to that consistency, discipline, so to speak.
Well, that brings something to mind. The consistency and discipline that I heard, and it's always stuck with me, is the only people, for example, that don't land a data science job are the ones that stopped applying, right? If you send enough applications and you do enough interviews, it is virtually impossible to not land a job. It could be 10,000, it could be 100,000, but I don't know anyone who's done 100,000 data science interview and not landed a job, right? Like that person does not exist on the planet. And, like, to me, that's something that's really special. I mean, I see this in my daily life all the time. I've talked about jujitsu a lot, but, I've been training for 2 years. I train usually around 3 to 6 days a week. And there have been people, to get your black belt, it's usually around 10 years of consistent training. And like, I'm athletic. I think I pick up things very well. Like, I was a professional golfer. Like, I understand sports and how to get better. But there are still people that have been doing this consistently for 10 years that I can't even get an advantage on. And they're old. Like, I'm physically superior to them, and it drives me insane. But at the same time, it's like, well, like, the time that they've put in and the consistency that they put in, they don't have to. It makes up for me being a better learner, or me being a more like physically superior person. And I think that is something that people overlook so often. And in sports, particularly like jiu-jitsu, it becomes immediately apparent. Or when you talk to one of these guys who've done their PhD in a specific field, you're like, oh, their understanding of this is like 3 levels further than mine.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, it's the integral, right? You have to invest time and intensity, and then you get kind of that surface. Otherwise, it's, no matter how fast you are, if you just started a week ago, unless you're like a super genius, then there is no way you can catch up that fast.
Yeah. Well, I also think, to a certain extent, super genius is a little bit of a myth, right? I think that people that pick up things really easily, it's because they've found they have like better parallels, right? So again, jujitsu example, sorry. Like, if I entered jujitsu and I'd wrestled, done like Greco-Roman wrestling for 5 years, and I did other martial arts for like judo or something for an extended period of time, I could be a white belt in jujitsu, but I have a black belt of experience and all these other parallel things. And people don't recognize that, like, there's so much crossover in a lot of these things that we do. So, I love this overarching like concept that we're touching on, because I feel like it liberates a lot of people, because they're just, it looks so easy when someone else does it, and you never realize all the stuff that they put into to get to where they are.
To just briefly add one point on that, like, I personally don't even believe in the concept of a genius, and that's a very, I know that's a very contrarian opinion to be had, but I can give a couple examples, and I think most of these people whom we consider geniuses historically started at a super young age, like with 4 or 5 years of like age, and they had some special context in their family, like either, for example, I think for Gauss or one of those big mathematicians, his father was like accountant, so he got exposed to numbers since he was 3 years old. And then for a lot of these kids, like Polgarov's sisters are a good example, where their dad literally wanted to make them world champions, and both of them became world champions. Like, what's the chance, if we're talking about genius levels, what's the chance of like you deciding something before your like daughters are born, and then you kind of push them through a training, and then with 13 years of age, they are like beating 50 plus years old like grandmasters in chess. So like the whole concept of a genius, I think, is also misunderstood. There are some, obviously, same as with height or any physical trait, there are some differences, but like it's not that big. Like, it's more, I think you can compensate for a lot of things if you spend 30 years doing something, right? And I think most people that we consider geniuses have just done that.
Yeah. I think a lot of that comes from exploiting something in a system early and getting compounding returns from it. So if I sat and learned chess, like how it was taught maybe 15 years ago for 10 years, I'd probably be worse at chess than if I sat and learned chess now with all the new technologies and tools and things that we know about chess and studied it for 10 years, right? And I think a lot of the geniuses, whoever taught them, or maybe they like figured it out themselves, they figured out a better way to pick something up or learn it, and they exploited it over time, so they just got so much further ahead. And there's definitely luck involved in that. There's mentorship, there's a lot of these types of things, but I I think that is a very real phenomenon. And I mean, I don't know if that we can say that that's not necessarily genius, that like their level of skill is not genius, but I don't think the foundations of making it are things that are beyond comprehension. I think that that's sort of what goes into what people perceive genius as, is like, oh, we can't explain this. They're a prodigy because this isn't something that we can comprehend. They're so good at so young, or whatever it might
like
be.
savants or something. But yeah,
exactly. So I want to make sure we have time to talk about Ortus. I also want to briefly touch on how you got your job at DeepMind and also why you left. Can you talk a little bit about how you landed your job at DeepMind, because it was a little bit unorthodox, and I really like this story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of the dots I've already kind of covered throughout the episode. But basically, while I was still at Microsoft, as I said, I started my YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel acted as a forcing function for me to read 500 plus, or I don't know, maybe even 1,000 plus papers at this point in time. So that means I probably read more papers than many PhD folks, even though I've never went the PhD route, just because I was so obsessed of like learning and going through these macro and micro cycles. And all of that kind of compounded. So I got noticed. I reached out to Petar Veličković, and I actually also covered. So he's a research scientist at DeepMind, and I covered some of his papers. And then he was like, "Hey, I'm going to refer you for DeepMind." And so because of the referral and my preps again, like where I again went through a bunch of resources to just get ready, and I managed to land the job. Having mentioned the referral, we talked about this before, but it's not like you don't really have to have a referral. Although for these big tech companies, just because of the pure like the supply and demand issue, where you have so many people applying and not that many spots freely available, obviously it helps to have somebody to recommend you. But in order to get to the situation where somebody will refer you, you have to give some value or show some skill, right? It's not like, oh, my friend just referred me. Like you have to somehow help those people or show that you are knowledgeable enough, and then get a referral. So it definitely
you want to make
helps.
them look good.
Yeah, well, not necessarily, but you just want to show that you are good, that you have what it takes, and then the person also has incentive, right? If they refer you and you get the job, they get the money. So there is also a financial incentive, if nothing else. Like most of those people don't do it for money; they do it just because they love to help other people. So but yeah, that's kind of
Amazing.
the
So, before we get to why you left, I am interested. You said you've read 500, 1,000 research papers. How can someone digest a research paper? How can someone get the most out of a research paper? Because that's something I know a lot of people struggle with, is like, oh, there's this technical knowledge. I don't understand half of these words. Like what, how do you interpret a research paper? Like what tips do you have for that?
I think, again, the mindset part here is very important. You initially have to be very comfortable with not knowing stuff and feeling dumb. I think that's a crucial skill, literally crucial skill. Because the first papers, when you just enter a field and you start reading, you initially don't even know the language. You don't speak the language. That's, I guess, an equivalent would be you go to Spain and you don't speak Spanish, and now you're trying to talk about philosophy. Like that's a second level, right? You have to first kind of get the terminology in place. And so the first couple of papers just serve for you to roughly understand what's going on, to pick up the terms, to notice some similarities. Okay, this fourth paper I'm reading, I now recognize like 85% of the words, and they just keep on repeating. I can see the pattern here. And so again, just by pure grit, just keep on reading, skimming the abstracts, looking at the visual diagrams, all of that, and also doing the coding, because you have to kind of complement it with the input and output, as I was saying. Then with time, you will get familiarity with the concepts, with the terminology, and it will kind of sink in. But it does take time, especially if it's your first paper ever. Like it takes some time to get like used to this type of writing, where sometimes authors have incentive to obfuscate things, and that's the unfortunate thing. Academia is not perfect. There's a lot of people who plagiarize. There is a lot of people who just do stuff like mathematical formulas just to increase their chances of looking smarter, and then like getting accepted to some journal or whatnot. It's actually a fact. That's not something I'm just like saying out. People are doing that. You can see on Twitter like professors commenting and et cetera, et cetera. And so yeah.
Something that ties into what we were talking about earlier is I think it's important to give yourself enough time. You're giving yourself 3 months to understand this concept. Probably the first month, for most people, they'll be struggling with the vocabulary. They'll be struggling to get the core concepts. And then by the second month, you're actually digesting the information. The third month, you're able to apply it or teach it or to output like you were describing. My question is a little bit about how you go about approaching that. So do you read like a bunch of papers, or do you try and focus on one at the start to just fully understand it? Is it more like, okay, I read 5 and then I go back to the first one because I'll have a new understanding of it, or is it a different process?
All of those are legit approaches. I think I've done most of those, depending like over the previous years. I've done most of those approaches. For example, for neural style transfer, because it was very visual and I was already, as I said, familiar with image processing, with computer vision. I was familiar with many concepts in the paper, but it was still fairly new, the paper itself. So I had to read it multiple times. And then I think I went through multiple open source repositories just to see how the code looks like. And then it clicked, because sometimes it's so much easier when you see the code than when you're reading the paper. Again, getting to that point where authors sometimes are really trying their best to make it like completely undigestible, where in essence, and especially now in 2023, a lot of these like prompting papers are literally a single trick I can tell in a single sentence, where they write like a 10 plus pages paper. Of course, the whole experimentation, etc. But like it should kind of be in the appendix section of the paper, not in the main body of the paper.
And AI writes the paper now too, so
exactly.
Amazing. So, going on from learning, let's talk about why you left DeepMind. And I'd love to hear everything about Ortus, because it's something I've been using. It's something that we're announcing that we're integrating into the YouTube channel as well, which I'm very, very excited about. So it'll be a resource for everyone watching my videos, your videos. Lex Friedman, I think Alex Freeberg, and a couple other people. So I'd love to hear about sort of the departure and why it is that you wanted to pursue a startup.
Makes sense. So like ever since I was wrapping up my faculty back in 2017, we actually back then built a small Android app and published it to Play Store. And we expected like a big boom. Like I was still completely unaware of the business dynamics of marketing, how everything works. And I was just like, it was kind of a meme app, and I expected some type of demand. Zero. And we were like, okay, I have to learn so much more, and I also have to. I want to see how it looks like to work for big tech companies. But like ever since that moment, I always had a timeout when I was like applying for a company. So that means when I was applying for Microsoft, I knew I'm going to stay roughly 2 years. And it turned out to be almost 3 years because the pandemic happened. So that kind of changed my direction. And it was same for DeepMind, even though it was like, in my opinion, definitely one of the best companies in the world. I think OpenAI now is like doing an amazing job. Like I would love to see how that looks like, but like now I'm completely determined on building my own thing. And so as I said, like even before I applied, I knew I'm not going to stay more than 1.5 years or 2 years. And that's obviously not something you can really communicate freely when you're applying for the company, because they always ask you, hey, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And like nobody's going to say like, oh, of course I'm going to be in this company and I'm going to be doing a great job. Like those questions sometimes also don't make much sense, right? Like because ambitious people do want to move, pick up the knowledge, contribute, and then go on their way. And I think that's completely fine, because ultimately many of those companies had people who went ahead and built their own stuff and created super influential like companies. And in general, I think that's helping us create a better economy, better world. And it's a healthy like it's a healthy dynamics. As long as you're not jumping back and forth every 6 months, and that's kind of your end goal. I don't see anything bad with like getting some experience and then continuing on to do what was your actual desire, like since however many years ago. And so that was kind of the case for me. And like long story short, I now started my first startup. So it's called Ortus, as you said. It's currently a Chrome extension, but that's not the end goal. Like what I'm trying to do here is reinvent how people watch videos. And because oftentimes people just passively watch videos, right? Especially when you have longer form like content, like Freeman or whatnot, like where you have 2+ hours or even 8 hours. Like people just sit down and sequentially watch it, and I don't think that's the right approach, because when you end up on a homepage of YouTube, for example, you have this recommended list of videos, right? And you never go sequentially through that list. So why would you? Sorry, just a second, my alarm. So why would you basically, if you have a huge video, why do you treat it as a monolithic artifact? Because it's not one. Like oftentimes the topics will be completely orthogonal, and you can watch them independently from each other. And so your goal when you end up in a video that has 8 hours like of content is to digest the parts that are relevant to you. And so what I'm trying to do is facilitate that process by allowing you to ask questions, get replies. Like you ask a question like, hey, which books did like Freeman recommend? And then you get like a full list of like bullet points. Hey, this and this and this book, and it happens literally at this timestamp in the video, and then you jump there and you watch that section. So that's kind of one feature of this whole like paradigm and way of thinking about how we consume videos. So going from like O of N search to O of one. And I'm just using nerdy terminology for saying, when you kind of open up those small thumbnails and trying to find what you're actually looking for, well, instead of doing that, what about just asking a question and getting straight to the point of the topic of your interest? So that's kind of what I think about it, how I think about it.
To me, there's, again, a couple of things that I really want to highlight that I think are interesting. We found that search is significantly more effective than going through a folder system, and like search versus organization is this big paradigm, right? With our emails, we go through and if we search, we're going to find what we want significantly faster than if we go through our folder structure. We have to figure out how to organize that, do all of that type of stuff. And I think what you're doing is making it so that we can get exactly what we want out of the videos without necessarily having to cut through all of the noise associated with them. There's also like two types of people that read a book. So I read a lot of self-help books. I read a book from beginning to end. One of my good friends, Jeff Lee, he looks at the table of contents and just reads the chapters that he finds most useful. I don't think either of those are right or wrong, but you're giving people the option to just focus on the things that they want to focus on, and not have to listen to the ramblings on or the tangents that I obviously love to go on. So that's super, super empowering. It's also incredible for anyone trying to maximize their learning from any of these videos and going back to them and making them useful again. So I'm again excited to have this integrated in my channel. Hopefully we'll also get it in the podcast channel, because the long form is very useful on that front as well. But before we, I do want to mention one thing that you said from the earlier conversation about why you went into Microsoft. You're like, hey, I knew I was going to leave and I knew I wanted to start this. I think purpose going into a career is really important. Like, we think so much about the job that we want to get that we overlook the other side of that, which is, what do I want to do with this job? Where do I want to be after that? And so many people land their first job and then they're like, man, I don't like this. Like I got the job, hooray. And then they have to start work and it sucks. And I think it is really awesome what you did, where it's like, hey, this is a means to an end. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to learn and do these things while I'm there. But Ortus or any of the future startups that you might have or companies that you might have, that's the real vision. That's where you're building the prerequisite skills. You're learning these things, but it's for this broader purpose rather than just to have a job or for consistency or whatever. But
yeah. And by the way, yeah, nicely put. I just want to say that like, by the way, I'm not encouraging anyone to do this exact same thing, because ultimately it boils down to self-awareness, right? So for me, because I was so entrepreneurial, that was the right path. But like, I just want to say, thanks God that we have people who are working at big tech for 10, 15 plus years. Because without that type of mentality and those people, we would not have sustainable big organizations. So like, I don't think there is one way to fit it all. Like that's very important to say. Like, and just like, if you think you should stay at Microsoft for 7 years, for 5 years, and then go on to build your own thing, or stay there for your entire life, like there is no judgment there. All of those are valid approaches. It just depends on what you want to do with your life, and like how I think it's also a function of like how entrepreneurial you are. If you're very entrepreneurial, then you probably will not stay at the same company for like 10 years because you want to build your own thing. But like if you're more of an IC, you're really passionate about doing like a great engineering slash research job, but like always having the organization around you that you don't have to think about, then working at a big tech or some more established company is the way to go. So yeah.
I agree, and it's also a function of risk as well. You know, I think people who are interested in entrepreneurship have a little bit more risk appetite. And you know, I want to double down on what you were saying is that I think purpose doesn't have to be what your purpose is, right? Or your intention about your work. Like someone's intention could be, hey, I want to have a long career at one of these tech companies. I want to have a long career in industry. That's totally valid. That's totally fine. That's not my personal intention. That's obviously not your intention. But just going in with some intention about that of like, hey, what do I actually want long-term out of any of these things is really important, because that gives us a lot more resiliency about the intermediary things that happen, right? If you land a job, right? If that was your end goal, then everything else you're going to have a crisis because you don't know what's next,
100%.
right?
And hopefully that's not your end goal. Yeah, hopefully that's not your end goal, because you have to do some great work there, right? Like
amazing. Aleksa, this is awesome. I'm so excited about Ortus. I'm so excited to have it integrated in the videos and for people to be able to use it and to be able to find, and this was such a gold mine of information and knowledge as well. Do you have any final thoughts? How also can people reach you? I'll put all of your links in the description and in the show notes as well.
No, I just want to say thanks a lot. Like, yeah, a lot of interesting, super thought-provoking questions. I guess so. Over the past weeks, my day-to-day was just mostly I'm coding and doing a lot of things solo. So it's always very refreshing to just chat with fellow like content creators and also technologists, if that's a word. So it was super nice to chat with you. As for where can people find me, I am very active on LinkedIn. Aleksa Gordić, and Twitter as well. I have a YouTube channel, DA Epiphany, and I have Discord servers as well, if that's something that people use. But yeah.
Amazing. I will put links to all of those in the description. And again, this was so awesome. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, Ken.